are going down, and I feel very strongly that they are definitely being hyped up.
But they've taken something and blown it so far out of proportion that it's destroying our country.
There's no question about it. This is a tough virus. It kicks the heck out of you if you get sick. But we believe that there's been an overreaction to the close down. And the damage that's being caused, people in the gig economy that are out of work, small businesses that are shut down. If you wait 2 years for a cure, they're all going to be destroyed.
NBC News political reporter Maura Barrett is in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania with more.
There were nearly 1,000 people here and hundreds more in their cars here at the state capitol this afternoon protesting Governor Tom Wolf here in Pennsylvania at the state capitol and the fact that the economy is not up and running. They're looking to get back to work because back in mid-March, the governor shut down a bunch of non-life sustaining businesses, and that caused more than 1.3 million people here in Pennsylvania to file for unemployment. And people here told me today that they think that healthy people should be able to go to work and sick people should stay home, and they're really frustrated with the lack of transparency, they say, that the governor is giving the state about when it's possible for them to reopen. And the organizer here tell me that this wasn't supposed to be a political event. People were supposed to stay in their cars and honk as they drove around the Capitol, but that's not what we saw here today. There was actually a lot of Trump 2020 flags, lots of Make America Great Again hats, as well as protesters with signs talking about other issues that aren't related to COVID-19. We saw a lot of pro-life signs and things about gun control. And so there was many flag signs as people flocked to the state's capital here. This afternoon, Governor Wolf gave a press conference updating the situation when it comes to the economy. He actually extended the stay-at-home order statewide through May 8th, so that's pushing it past where the original April 30th date was. But he's trying to make some small baby steps to get the state back to normalcy. He says he's letting state liquor stores do curbside pickup, and he's also going to allow online car sales as well as some new construction sites to get up and running again. And he says you can't flip a switch to get the economy rolling again as much as he wishes that was the case, but a slower rollout and a data-driven regional approach is the way he's going to go.